So I suppose that I can't think of metaphilosophy as being distinct from philosophy. It seems to me more like a kind of attitude to your discipline, really. I think it bespeaks a certain kind of openness, and again, I think that's what people should take from Rorty's work is that sense that you can continue doing philosophy with, I guess, with a small p, I think, as he called it. That and that's continuous with philosophy with a big P. It's the bigger tent.
Welcome, everyone. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Dr. Neil Gascoigne. Neil teaches philosophy at Royal Holloway, University of London. He is the author or co-author of several books, including a wonderful introduction to Richard Rorty, Liberalism, Irony, and the End of Philosophy, and another book called Tacit Knowledge, co-written with Tim Thornton, Skepticism, and more recently, Rorty, Liberal Democracy and Religious Certainty. He has contributed chapters to the Cambridge Companion to Richard Rorty, as well as the Blackwell Companion to Rorty. Your recent articles include Making Progress, Pragmatism, Conceptual Engineering, and Ordinary Language, and Taking Rorty Seriously, Pragmatism, Metaphilosophy, and Truth, co-authored with Michael Bacon. So welcome, Neil. I'm really excited to be speaking with you.
Delighted, absolutely, to be here.
Let's start, if you would, with a little bit of your journey in philosophy, how it started.
Yeah, so I came to philosophy relatively late, I suppose, compared with the kind of professionalization of academic disciplines these days. So I did my first degree in electronic engineering, and while I was doing that, I became an enthusiast for Russian culture, especially Shostakovich and Russian literature around the time of the kind of early Lenin period. And so I decided after I graduated that I was going to become a Russian specialist. So I went off and did a postgraduate course in, I guess, what we call Kremlinology these days. And it just happened that while I was doing that, I had an elective and I decided to do philosophy of science, which was a kind of private study. I can't remember who it was with, but it was with some philosophy lecturer at what was then Birmingham University. So yeah, so it was the height of perestroika then. So everybody thought, well, that's it. There's no problems with Russia in future. We can we don't need Kremlinologists. We don't need people to commentate on what's going on in the Soviet Union or Russia. And so I thought, well, I don't want to spend 3 years in an archive in Moscow. So I basically thought, oh, well, it's probably time to go and get a job. So I went off to work in the city, and I absolutely hated that. So I thought, I think I'll probably just go back to university. And I remember the course that I'd done on philosophy of science, and I thought, well, I'll go and do a master's in philosophy of science. So I went off to Cambridge, and I was interested in that time in consciousness and things like that, and I started doing this MPhil, master's degree, and I went on to do a PhD while I was there. And it was a kind of an odd period at the time because I was in the history and philosophy of science department, and the philosophy department was headed up by, I won't mention his name, it'd be obvious for people who are familiar with this period, by somebody who was very, very historically antipathetic to Rorty. And the rumor really was that when Rorty left Princeton, they tried to get him to head up the philosophy department at Cambridge, and that this person had largely organized a kind of writing campaign to get Rorty, because of the influence of philosophy in the mirror of nature, to get him to withdraw his application and not go and not come to England. So this guy just basically let it know that he didn't want people working on Rorty, but I was relatively insulated because I was in a separate department, and my, I guess, unofficial supervisor was quite keen on Rorty, and he was a friend of Quentin Skinner, and they sort of encouraged me to contact Rorty. So I wrote to him, and I went off to the University of Virginia for a year and stayed there and worked with Rorty. And I guess, while I was there, it was fantastic. Rorty was an incredibly kind of friendly and supportive person, and completely convinced me that I shouldn't write about him at all. So I decided I wouldn't write and Rorty. He also told me not to write about R.G. Collingwood as well, which was one of my other enthusiasms at the time. But yeah, so that was it, and I came back and I did my I wrote up my dissertation on called naturalizing the subject. Yeah, and I guess that was the early period. I mean, I guess the irony is that I was also real enthusiastic for Thomas Nagel's work, so I also wrote to Nagel. But at the time, Nagel was in Paris, so he couldn't, as it were, host my visit to New York. So so I could possibly have gone off to New York instead. In which case, who knows how different
Yeah.
things might have been.
Right, right. Very different interests and possible directions. So I'm curious how, after that philosophy of science course and then your decision to go and study philosophy formally, from there, how your interests and concerns changed over time. Because the interest of a person who gets in philosophy usually are not the same as the person who decides to stay and then like completes a PhD. Even after the PhD, interests might change.
Yeah, I think one of the odd things about if you haven't done an undergraduate degree, you feel both sort of, you've got imposter syndrome because you feel that everybody else has gone through 3 or 4 years more kind of formal education in a subject than you, but you also feel kind of liberated from the kind of the canon in a way. And so the curiosity of reading, for example, Rorty, when I was literally just starting philosophy, was this thought that you could read absolutely anything, right? You could be reading Wittgenstein and Heidegger one day, you could be reading Proust the next day, you could be reading, sort of anything from the history, and across there's divisions between, what's sometimes called European and analytic philosophy. So so for me, there was never any kind of real distinction between the genres of philosophy. And so I guess my PhD kind of emerged from that, really. It emerged from this sense of, well, what is this crazy subject called philosophy? What is it that people like Derrida have in common with people like Wittgenstein and, David Lewis and Daniel Dennett but in some sense, I felt authorized to ask that kind of question just because, having read Rorty, it just seemed the most natural question to ask. So really, my dissertation was all about, are there better or worse ways to kind of do philosophy, and what makes a better way, and a worse way, a worse way. And I think in that sense, my interests have not really changed very much. They've kind of just ramified from that central, I guess, metaphilosophical question. And they've just kind of gone off in various directions. But that's kind of at the heart of it. And it's striking and really maybe kind of depressing. In anticipation of this, I kind of leafed through my PhD. I was quite shocked to see how much the 20-odd-year-old Neil is like me in his interests. Yes, I don't think in some sense my core interests have really changed, or my core orientation has really changed. I hate philosophical dogmatism, and I dislike the idea of like closing off the canon. And I guess that I get that from Rorty, from that early period. So
right. What he described in terms of, it could be described as a kind of imposter syndrome, but it's also like not being fully immersed in a structure and a profession or a tradition that results in a kind of like a critical stance, a stance that is more reflective of what is going on, and a kind of the critique is almost naturally flows out of that stance, the relationship with the particular relationship with the canon and the tradition. So I'm imagining that this is the beginning point of metaphilosophy, as you described, like what is good philosophy and what is it that makes it good. So this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you. What metaphilosophical questions you are interested in, and what metaphilosophical questions you are not interested in? What kind of metaphilosophy that you wouldn't, go for, and why?
yeah, I suppose it depends a bit on what you think metaphilosophy is. I think there's a little reflection in, is it Rorty's kind of autobiographical piece, Trotsky and the Wild Orchids, and he talks about, I think, quite artfully talking about the period after philosophy and the mirror of nature, and spending the next X number of years trying to work out what philosophy, if anything, is kind of good for. And I think the thought is the in trying to evaluate that, you're not taking a second order stance on the subject matter of philosophy. So I suppose that I can't think of metaphilosophy as being distinct from philosophy. It seems to me more like a kind of attitude to your discipline, really. I think it bespeaks a certain kind of openness. And again, I think that's what people should take from Rorty's work is that sense that you can continue doing philosophy with, I guess, with a small p, I think, as he called it, that and that's continuous with philosophy with a big P. It's the bigger tent. And yes, and that so metaphilosophy is more of an attitude than a set of specific questions that one might want to ask about, the ends of philosophy or the methods of philosophy. I think it's a kind of openness in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And maybe being, would you say there is a danger in completely dissociating philosophy from those attitudes? Philosophy that becomes completely devoid of that meta questions or meta concerns. There's something happens to it.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I think that's what motivated that piece about taking Rorty seriously, was the sense that it seemed to me and to Michael as well that Rorty was being kind of pushed into this kind of box to make him just a little bit more manageable. That that he was just doing metaphilosophy and that therefore you could therefore kind of summarize what his contribution to philosophy might be. And that seemed just to me to be antipathetic to what really animated Rorty, and what actually is for me his kind of lingering legacy is that idea that metaphilosophy is an attitude towards a discipline of philosophy that keeps it open to methods and questions and engagements. So yes, I absolutely agree with you. I think that trying to separate them out is disastrous for philosophy, because it loses part of its reflective self, but it's disastrous for metaphilosophy as well, because then it loses any grip on its subject matter. It's
I remember this when I used to be in academia. I had colleagues in analytic philosophy, and a couple of times I asked them, why would you ask these questions? Why would you pursue these projects? And one type of response that I got was, well, this is the type of questions that analytic philosophers are interested in.
yeah.
This is like a circular self-reflective or reflex professionalization. Anyways, before getting more into Rorty, I'm curious about maybe 2 or 3 other thinkers that have especially influenced your work and thought. I'm now wondering about is Thomas Nagel is still there or no?
I think about Nagel, especially the Nagel writing at the time when I first did philosophy, is that you think about the collection of essays, was it Mortal Questions, where he's talking about things like absurdism and the fundamental opposition between a subjective point of view and an objective point of view, and it has a certain kind of grandiosity, a certain sort of expansiveness that I think, for me anyway, I don't know, reflected another part of the appeal of philosophy. Rorty seemed to be all about cosmopolitanism, and Nagel seemed to be about a kind of a purity of an absolute search of the the seriousness of an intellectual undertaking that would that could drive a career or drive a kind of a worthwhile life of the mind. And it seemed to me that I could have, that's in some sense the thought about if I'd gone to New York, I can well imagine that one might have emerged from that with a more Nagelian vision of what doing philosophy was. Whereas, of course, I've come to think that the Nagelian vision of philosophy is disastrous for philosophy. But it was incredibly appealing for somebody coming from, a basically science engineering background. Sort of, I guess it's the kind of the attractiveness of like the Tractatus was for Wittgenstein or something, the idea that you could, there's a really big set of questions there that you could spend your life addressing, so I think that Nagel was a kind of influence at that time, but I think he probably pushed me kind of into the arms of Rorty when I kind of confronted what it would be to kind of pursue a Nagel-like project in philosophy. I mean, at the time that I was certainly a graduate student, then Davidson was a huge figure, and obviously Putnam was still kind of quite influential on the scene. But weirdly now, when I think back to it, I think of Austin and Kant and especially Wittgenstein as the real influences, either through other people or directly. And when I read Davidson now, who seems to have fallen very much out of kind of favor, I just can't see in anything in the later Davidson or even really much in the later Putnam that just isn't there in Wittgenstein. It just seems to me kind of warmed over Wittgensteinian philosophy. And I think that maybe that's in part, there's like a whole generation of those, sort of big major figures, canonical figures in American philosophy who just never really read Wittgenstein.
Mhm.
They just never took him very seriously. Did Quine read Wittgenstein? I mean, I don't think so, right? And I think coming through that kind of philosophy of science, kind of Quinean tradition, of that kind of naturalistic tradition, I think their sense of their own projects were very actually quite circumscribed. And I suppose when they reached their kind of like, their later years, they began to see that a lot of their concerns about the subjective versus the objective and stuff were, the anti kind of metaphysical realism. They were already there in the philosophical investigations. So I see probably a greater influence, now from sort of people like the ordinary language philosophy tradition, which I think has been kind of not by people like Cavell, of course, but I think overlooked for the large part by pragmatists.
Mhm.
So
Mhm. Great, great. Any other figure in more maybe European continental tradition, people like Deleuze or Lyotard, that you kind of sense an affinity with? Maybe not
yeah,
influence.
I mean, I mean, I loved reading Deleuze's books on, like on Spinoza and Kant when I was a student. I never really got into the whole, sort of the stuff with Guattari and things. So I think by that time I developed a certain kind of, I think again, Rortian sniffiness about kind of this kind of late Heideggerian excess or something. So
Mhm.
Leotard, I never really got the point of.
Okay.
Again, like I was enthused by the postmodern condition as when it came out because again everybody seemed to be reading it and stuff. But no, I don't really think so. I mean, obviously, I've enjoyed reading Habermas's work over the years, but I don't think there's anything that's really kind of like clicked with me
Mhm.
since the kind of the Kant Hegel kind of axis. Again, Heidegger, obviously, but if you approach Heidegger with that kind of pragmatist orientation already in place, then there's a limit to how much you can get out of the earlier stuff.
Right,
I
right.
think for me anyway. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I teach a course on mind and world, and I include discussion of Wittgenstein and Heidegger, obviously, in that. But I
Mhm.
always get the feeling that by the time I've gone through the Wittgenstein, when I'm starting to talk about Dasein, I'm slightly going backwards rather than forwards. Obviously, Being in Time was written before the investigations, but those issues about the legacy of the transcendental tradition, it makes it a bit harder to make the same kinds of points, I think. So
Mhm. Mhm. Uh, Something that I heard and I really appreciated in your response is sometimes we like a philosopher not necessarily for their own sake and what they do, but the way they counteract the potential influence of other philosophers, like how Rorty, like being involved with his work, kind of pushes aside certain, like maybe overly flowery kind of styles of philosophy that are maybe too much in the too preoccupied with language in a certain way, with style for its own sake. So maybe is any other notes on the importance of Rorty, and I was curious about how you see your own engagement with Richard Rorty to differ from other Rorty scholarship that you have observed.
yeah, it's probably the first work of Rorty's that I read was Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And I mean, I arrived in Cambridge basically, I think about the year after Rorty had given those lectures or part of the lectures that led up to that book in Trinity College. And I bought, I think I bought it, my battered copy of it, I bought, it's like falling apart. I bought it in 1989 in New York. And I absolutely loved that book. I absolutely loved it. And then I started getting, so I read it several times, and then I just started getting really, really quite bored reading it. I just didn't find it interesting anymore. And then I was quite interested when there was a kind of very powerful revival of interest in Rorty's work amongst a whole, kind of younger generation of scholars. They were just interested in contingency, irony, and solidarity. For them, that was the foundational Rorty text. And they were completely uninterested in anything that Rorty had done before that, because they just thought that that was the natural culmination of a certain kind of trajectory, a movement away from the concerns of analytic philosophy towards what would become philosophy as cultural politics. But by that time, I'd become much, much more interested in the kind of earlier methodological pieces that Rorty had written, especially the papers leading up to Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature and around that time, because they seem to me to make much more obvious connections, much more useful connections with other kinds of concerns in philosophy. So I guess in some sense, I was kind of just following probably the pattern that people like Michael Williams and Brandon followed when, as Rorty's kind of original kind of Princeton wave of students, found his interest, that kind of diverging more and more from the kind of philosophy that they'd picked up from him as, as graduate students. So I think that my interest in Rorty is probably in a kind of period that most people now just don't think of as being very interesting. I'm really interested in when Rorty was just a bit more explicitly Strawsonian / Wittgensteinian, when he was thinking about what the appropriate, what might be a useful method for pragmatists in the context of those kinds of issues that were dominating analytic philosophy at the time. Mm-hmm. So, and I think because I'm kind of just generally interested in epistemological questions and things, that again makes more sense to me. I'm kind of.
I sense also a concern with continuity and finding, like Rorty's position, for example, or any philosopher, their stance at a given point in time. How is that related? How is it continuous, as opposed to how representing a break from their past work? I sense that especially in your first book on Rorty.
Yes, that's right. And I think it's probably as a result of that I then just started finding, the kind of not the really stuff, but the kind of like the 70s stuff more interesting. Because it seemed to me that there was a road, a path not taken, because I think he just got kind of bored with that particular way. But it seemed to me just more interesting for addressing other kinds of problems, the kind of things that I've sort of gone on to look at, like,
mm-hmm.
like, tacit knowledge and know-how and religious knowledge and things like that. So,
mm-hmm. Okay. I want to ask you about your book, Rorty, Liberal Democracy and Religious Certainty. And to me, maybe I'm focusing on part of it that is not really the focus, but for me, the figure of the liberal ironist and Rorty's general picture of where we should go, how we should, our general sentiments, it doesn't seem to have room for a kind of conviction that you like to bring in. So you are focusing on, or you're bringing in, letting have some room for religious conviction and religious certainty, and exploring how that would look like in Rorty and liberal democracy. And to me, that's a very significant thing to engage with, and for me, very important. So please tell us a little bit more about this book and its motivations. And
no, that's a very kind way of putting it. I mean, interestingly, somebody contacted me recently, were asking about this book and asking me, and it seemed to me all the questions they were asking me were about, how does this allow us to deal with fundamentalism? How does this allow us to draw a distinction between the public and the private? And I sort of wrote back to them because actually I knew I was doing this, and I thought it might be quite helpful for me to remember what it was that I'd been thinking at the time. And I just thought that's just not the way that I approached it. I didn't want to, come up with some iteration of of a kind of liberal public-private kind of view on this. What I wanted to do was try and approach it from the position of the intellectual who has beliefs, as it were. Not the intellectual in some natural class, but people who genuinely question the kind of status of their own beliefs and what that kind of commits them to. And I was just kind of struck at writing it when I first started thinking about it, about these kind of parallels, especially amongst some kind of Christian philosophers or philosophers of religion, the way that they were drawing parallels between skeptical and anti-skeptical arguments in epistemology, more kind of traditional epistemology, and the arguments that they were using to then legitimate the kind of rational standing of their religious convictions. And I thought, well, it would just be kind of interesting to see whether I could kind of construct an argument that someone like that, somebody who was posing those kinds of problems or questions about their beliefs, an argument that I could potentially convince them of, that there was a kind of way of thinking about certainty that comes from the kind of Wittgensteinian tradition that might lead you to conclude, not because someone has told you that that's public as opposed to private or private as opposed to public, that you might yourself, as it were, want to set kind of limits on the relevance of those kinds of beliefs to other kinds of debates. So it was an attempt to do it as a kind of, inside out or bottom up, rather than a kind of a top imposition of some version of a kind of Lockean, sort of story. So, and I think you're right. I think that in some sense, that was a dimension that was missing from Rorty. And I think that's why Rorty appears to kind of change his mind between the kind of conversation stopping idea and the more accommodating view that he has later. But I think it's because he's kind of wedded to that. It's back to contingency, irony, and solidarity again. He's still wedded to the kind of the significance of this public-private distinction. And that was something I just, when I wrote the book on Rorty, I could just not quite get my head around. I could never really, I tried to think about different levels in which one could think about this. It's clearly not a metaphysical distinction. It's a sort of political distinction, but what kind of political distinction is it? I could never really make it work for me. And so I thought maybe an approach that didn't take that for granted, but tried to, as it were, construct it from different resources might be more effective or more interesting.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the difference is when we regard a sentiment, any sentiment, including religious sentiment, or it could be artistic sentiments, we can have a position of maybe saying like dismissing them, disregarding them, or we can adopt a position of embracing those sentiments, but in a way that includes self-regulatory processes of those sentiments, regulating the person regulating it in an autonomous way, in a way that allows room for other things and dialogues.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think that's why the person who wrote to me was disappointed, because I think that he thought that in there there'd be an argument that would stop people going out into the streets and killing somebody because of their beliefs. And my thought was, nothing is going to stop people doing that, right? Or certainly nothing that any philosopher writes. But that's not a reasonable project for a philosopher. Whereas if you could bring these broader epistemological considerations, it was also for me a way of validating, I guess, my continuing interest in those questions. That ultimately, if pragmatists can't draw on those sorts of broader considerations, then they are again denying themselves resources that might be useful in certain contexts. So I guess that was my not intentional, but a kind of sideways swipe at pragmatists who are overly obsessed or overly concerned with the idea that Rorty's view starts with contingency and that's it, and they don't really need to think about these broader kind of questions.
What projects are you currently working on, or what sort of questions keep you up?
Well, I mean, one of them is in some sense quite kind of straightforward. So I've been banging on for quite a long time about how we should read Rorty's eliminativism from this perspective of concept change. And it seems to me that that actually Rorty does develop something at that time, and I think he does kind of use it as a kind of method in later work, as a kind of informal way of thinking about hope and progress and what it is to try and move us from where we are now to where we want to get, and to be able to justify that kind of move. But it seemed to me that he kind of denuded the formal resources for doing that kind of thing, and there are really good resources for thinking about that in people like Austin in the ordinary language tradition. And so I thought, well, there might be an interesting way of marrying that kind of that tradition with a kind of the pragmatist interest in concept change that comes out of philosophy of science. Right. So you think about people like Carnap, for example, and Carnap's account of explication, what it is to explicate a concept, so that in some sense it does all the work it used to do, but it's better, right? And obviously Carnap was only interested in scientific concepts, right? But then you've got Quine coming along, and Quine offers a different take on explication, because obviously he's deprived pragmatists of the analytic synthetic distinction, which Carnap relied on for much of his analysis. And then you've got Davidson with, kind of radical interpretation, which I think of as kind of part of the same tradition. So I was wondering about whether you could tell a story that led from Carnap talking about, the concept of fish and things like that, and the concept of, obviously lots of stuff about set theory and various other kind of mathematical concepts that I'm not, very well qualified to judge on. But whether you could tell a story from that would lead through to kind of a Davidson-Rorty account that emphasized the continuity of the concern with how do you make pronouncements about the future, and how do you justify them? How do you get people from here to there? And so I've been working on that for quite a while. But then I got sidetracked by something which is relevant, which kind of pops up in a small way in a couple of pieces, which is the debate about trans rights. So for about a year now, I've been working on, I'm just really intrigued by the idea that the way that, for example, gender talk has taken over from sex talk, and what this tells us about the relationships between these concepts, and how this change took place, and what this change kind of means. What does it mean, for example, to start thinking about what it is to be a man or a woman in terms of self-assignment? The self-assignment of states is a very, very unusual kind of device, right? There aren't many things that, for we post-Cartesians, that the self is authoritative about. The whole shift of philosophy since the 18th century has been to decenter the self. But of course, the conception of the self at the center of identity politics is very different from that. So I've never been particularly interested in cultural politics and stuff, but this has really kind of interested me, because when I read stuff about the political significance of trans rights, and the idea that that sex/gender are self-assigned states, I just find it hard to see what the arguments are for such positions. And yet, I don't know about in North America, but certainly in Britain, it's pervasive, right? I mean, there are constant arguments, kind of emerging into the public sphere, involving, invariably prisoners being insisting on going to certain prisoners, and people sort of randomly self-assigning, and feminists divided on both sides. So I thought it'd be a really good case study for the idea of concept change. How does this change take place, or what are the implications for the change? And can we make a projection on the basis of, sort of like the inferential connections between these concepts and other concepts, on what those sorts of changes might bring about? If you can self-ascribe, sex/gender states, then, what other kinds of state could you self-ascribe, right? So that's what I've been working on. But it's I don't know, unusually for me, it's quite political.
Yeah.
And even some of the casual conversations I've had with people have gone in directions that I wouldn't have predicted.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah.
I've been wondering about how best to present the work. So
Yeah, that's a really the way you're approaching this topic is really I have in mind your work on making progress and how the solution cannot come from a technical approach of a technical approach to language, the conceptual engineering approach that is divorced from the facts of the matter or reality, the lived experience. At the same time, lived experience that claims itself as a private, completely subjective, cannot be the solution. Because if I say this is the
Yeah.
way things are appear to me, I can't, it can't be the case that I'm just reporting something to you that is only accessible to me. I'm reporting something that is ultimately in the long term is going to be part of a shared reality. So it is, I agree with you. It is a, despite the controversy surrounding it, it's a very exciting philosophical opportunity as a
It
topic.
is, and but I guess the worry is, and I think this is again that is that it's very difficult again, especially in the UK, to have open discussions about these things. Discussions. I mean, people often talk, especially university students, about safe spaces, but actually, a lot of these spaces aren't safe for debate because the opinion can be galvanized in such a way that there is no actual debate takes place. You just end up with shouting matches between
Hmm.
people, and that's been a kind of a surprising development. I mean, it's happened very, very quickly, and it's odd to see it in one's own professional lifetime.
Hmm.
Where you get emails from colleagues saying, I wouldn't say anything about this because it's more than my job's worth and that kind of stuff. Just
Hmm.
really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Now I want to ask you about this notion of tacit knowledge because sometimes philosophers think about, or people in general, think about tacit knowledge as something that is not yet explicated, that is not, we are not yet fully aware of it. We haven't brought it into language yet, but it's something that we could. Another way to think about tacit knowledge is something that doesn't want to be, that we really don't want to make it explicit. Like the professional philosopher, for example, who doesn't want to engage in questions about philosophy, or the person who has maybe certain conservative ideas about gender and they don't want to discuss it in other ways. In general, I wanted to just open up this maybe as one question. It's not a very clearly formulated question, but I wanted to hear your reflections on this, the significance of tacit and our relation to what is possible relations to tacit knowledge and tacit engagements.
yeah, I think I'm going to disappoint you.
I don't think so.
Um, so I said I've been working on those two pieces, and I did. I was meant to give a paper at music and tacit knowledge in Switzerland. I think it was during the height of the COVID or just after, in one of the various lapses. And they basically, I couldn't get a visa to get into Switzerland
Mm,
to give this talk. So I kind of gave it through online. But I guess they'd asked me to give this because they thought that I'd have something interesting to say about the relationship between tacit knowledge and the production of music. But when I prepared the paper and I was thinking about, Tim Thornton and I had an agreement that neither of us would publish anything that disagreed with what we'd written in that book for 10
wow.
years. And then we could write whatever we liked, right? That
Okay.
would give us time to change our minds, right? I mean, my contributions to that book came from the perspective of kind of, I guess, a kind of proto-conceptual engineering slash, kind of pragmatism, whereas Tim is a straight Wittgensteinian, right? So, but given our kind of combined interest in Wittgenstein, it really converged around that kind of view. But it seemed to me that all things tacit are actually really deeply misleading. So with the first part of your point about the tacit not being hidden knowledge, that seemed to me absolutely right. It seemed to me that we shouldn't actually talk about tacit knowledge at all. So my view to these kind of musicologists was stop using the word tacit knowledge,
Mhm.
because tacit knowledge it just carries that view of the inner outer, the hidden, the explicit. So I think in what some people think of as tacit knowledge, it's not hidden at all. It's just it sounds dreadful, and it's kind of Wittgensteinian quote. I guess it's McDowellian, isn't it? It's there for those who have eyes to see it, right?
Oh,
So You might be a fantastically accomplished musician, but no one's going to appreciate your, the superb nature of your performance if they themselves are musical ignoramuses, right? So it's hidden from them, but it's not hidden from them in the sense that it's kind of somehow behind a veil. It's just that they themselves lack the abilities to appreciate the knowledge that's actually in plain view.
Mhm.
So I guess the view I've come to on tacit knowledge is that it's a misnomer, really. It's a misnomer, and I think Tim and I do argue this in the book. We should just think of it as practical know-how. And what we should have said at the end of the book is, and by the way, there isn't any tacit knowledge, right? The
Okay.
only the only thing you can get from the concept of tacit knowledge is practical know-how, and all
Mhm.
the rest is just mystification. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just that practical know-how is not available to everybody because if you don't have the relevant skills yourself, you can't see it. But because
Mhm.
you can't see it doesn't mean it's hidden, right?
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
like the Pauline letter, right? It's in plain view, but you've got to know where to look.
Wow. You made the connection to to the I don't know if you had in mind the Lacan the seminar on the Purloined letter, but you just Poe himself. So but when you said just practical knowledge, I just immediately had that psychoanalytic response to your so what about the repressed? But maybe I should
Yeah,
invite you for
yes.
another conversation for that because it's an entirely different can of worms.
I should confess that my actual PhD supervisor was John Forrester, who actually edited Lacan's uh,
Wow.
seminars, and I did write my master's dissertation on Freud. So
Wow.
so there is a bit of psychoanalysis hidden in the background I never mentioned earlier. So
Cool, cool. I'm glad we got to it. Um, um, well, I think that's it for now. I kept you for long, and we had some technical difficulties. Thank you so
we
much for
did.
being patient. I think we also have a little bit of asynchrony between us, so it takes some patience, and I'm grateful that you exercise patience in that.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to address before we conclude?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that your questions were excellent, and
Thank you so
they've
much.
been very helpful for me in thinking about where I am sort of intellectually and where I want to go to from here. So, and that's not something I often stop and think about. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm very
no, thank
grateful.
you very much.
Hopefully, we'll have more conversations later on.
I hope so.
I-
I hope so.